to episode 171 of The Route. The Route is a glorified coffee chat and podcast form that takes you from A to B with a new guest every episode. As always, I'm your host, Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we get into today's guest, just a couple things to go over. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, follow the podcast, rate 5 stars. All of those action items allow the podcast to grow a little bit easier. We're available on all major podcasting platforms. That's Spotify, Google, Apple, Amazon, 6 or 7 others as well that are a bit smaller. But essentially, if you can listen to a podcast, we're on it. So check us out there, The Route Podcast on all platforms. And just do those items there because it allows the podcast to grow a bit easier, as I mentioned. With that too, that was more so in regards to audio platforms. We're also available on video. If I'm not mistaken now, this might be our 110th episode on video, and you can find us on YouTube. When you search The Route Podcast, will be the first result there, or you can simply search at The Route Cast. That's our username for all of our channels and pages. And with that, you can then see clips on our YouTube as well. So you can get to see little excerpts from the episode, get to have an understanding of what that person might be speaking about, and if it's of interest to you for that week's episode. Building on that as well, I touched on all the other social media platforms: TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. Any social platform you can think of, we're on it as well at The Routecast. That's where you can see, who's coming on the podcast that week, and also those clips that I previously mentioned. So check us out at The Routecast on all platforms. And lastly, and most importantly, we're on LinkedIn. It's a little different from maybe other podcasts, but obviously we're talking to people about their careers and maybe how you can impart that on your own career. So by all means, check us out on LinkedIn at The Routecast. You can connect with myself, the guests, other like-minded people, and that will allow you to maybe grow your network, start your network, maintain it, all good stuff from there. But check us out, all platforms, including LinkedIn, at The Routecast. Well, with that now said, let's get into today's guest. I'd now like to welcome someone who has experience in marketing, entrepreneurship, teaching, and even hosting their own podcast. Glenn Schmelzle, welcome to The Route. How's it going?
It's going all right, Chris, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for the podcast. Kudos on getting past 100 episodes. I am so privileged to be in this company that has shared their stories of their route, and I'm hoping to share something of my own that might just give a few people out there some new ideas.
Perfect. That's what the podcast is all about. So with that said, the podcast is called The Route, so let's get into yours. So where did it maybe begin? If you went to school or when you graduated high school, how did that whole story begin, and how do we get to where we are today in 2024?
Yeah, thank you so much. I would begin, so you introduced me as a marketer. So, what is that? The skill set that I think makes a marketer, it's not something you're going to be a child prodigy at. This is something that you gain by picking up your verbal skills, by picking up good written skills, by picking up a good sense of numeric literacy and looking at trends. You pick it up in terms of understanding how story is a powerful component that drives us to seek things and make them, and it also drives people to try to have something that can be marketed. And we live in a system that has a pretty, the free market is great, but you need marketers in order to facilitate the meeting of a person with a need and a company that has something that they need. All to say, I didn't have a sense of any of that in grade school or high school. But if I look backwards, I can see some early things, little pebbles that I picked up that perhaps gave me that mixture that made me into what I can do today in terms of how to market. And I like to think that I can demonstrate how marketing works so that companies can take on the crazy risk that there is in a commercial venture where you're trying to help people with. And I'm glad to get into kind of what some of those are. So, if we take me, I'm in grade school or high school. I'm actually a little bit shy. I'm bookish, and I got thrown into a little bit of the speaking because my parents thought that I should go in for those school public speech competitions. And so I tried a few of those, did okay. I then got thrown into a kids camp, and it wasn't just like a sports camp. It was a camp where they made you practice reciting poetry and, little short talks on subjects. Think of like a mini TED Talk. So there I am, figuring out how to do those things, getting over that kind of stage frightish stuff, and being able to pick up a little bit of sense of how you tell a story. We go through high school, the classes were all okay, but one of the things that, again, I got kind of thrown into was one teacher turned to me one day and said, if we don't get somebody to help us out with our yearbook, we're not going to have a yearbook next year. And, high school's kind of short, and I was a small high school, so I thought, well, that would stink to not have a yearbook. I went there. Shouldn't there be something to document it? So I got picked to be yearbook editor. But that gave me a sense of, well, how do you outline things? How do you lay them out in a way? How do you make sense of a lot of information that somebody will actually find interesting to look at and read and share? And, these are all kind of pre-internet things. I realize it sounds rather dinosaurish. However, the writing, the speaking, the arranging of things, these are all just as relevant in a digital world today. And so, if I go back to that kind of grade school, high school time period, I can see a few things that enable me to do all sorts of things today that if I hadn't had those little inflection points, I might not have felt that I wanted to communicate or that I had anything worth communicating. I was an awful communicator back in those days, but I got enough practice at it, and I wanted so badly to be understood by people with the information that I felt was worth sharing that I just had to get good at it.
That's very interesting. And I guess going back to that, when you initially went to those camps, I remember like when I was a kid, right, my parents would put me in, so I'm Portuguese, they put me in Portuguese school, or I grew up in Quebec, but I'm English, so then I went to indoor soccer, and it was all French, and I hated it because it was so French, but I loved playing the sport. Did you ever have those moments where you were essentially pushing against those, skill sets that you're going to develop, but then later on pay dividends?
Yeah, very much so. Fish out of water, and yet I'm glad that I was thrown into those things. Another one, was I had a brief time at a coding camp. It was, I think, a week long. And if people think that, programming is it's good today, you can use ChatGPT to help, you can YouTube stuff, you can Stack Overflow it. Back then, if you weren't kind of getting it, and the languages were very arcane and hard to decipher, that was one of those times where I felt a lot like a fish out of water, and I just didn't want to keep banging my head against that wall. What's, to me, very funny about that is, as we'll get into later, a huge chunk of my adult life is spent around code and people who code. And so I, it leaves me with two things. It's like, know what you want, know what you feel inclined to do and what you don't feel inclined to do, but appreciate what people who do that, what it takes for them. And it takes all kinds. So I think you can get benefit even when you come away from that experience going, not for me.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And I guess building on that, then, what did that start to lead to? Obviously, you touched on, being a yearbook editor in high school. That maybe started to open your doors and, your mindset to things, maybe looking back at it. But where do things go from there after high school? I think, people listening are typically more so in the young professional range. There's previously, maybe university students, but where do things go when you started off your career? Was that something where you knew exactly where you were going to go with that skill set that you maybe started to develop, or was it,
Right.
hey, let's just try some things and see what sticks?
Yeah. I'm happy to say that, and I really don't think my answer is uncommon as a Gen Xer. I think I followed a fairly traditional schooling path. It was, when you're in Gen X, you're the children of the boomer generation, or even the one just prior to that. And it's very much at that stage of the game, oh my goodness, you got to get a good job. You got to be able to afford, transportation and lodging, and you got to get all that covered. So, I go off to university. And in university, based on liking to read, being okay at writing, I go in for an arts degree. So I'm taking political science, I'm taking a lot of history, and it's good, but there's absolutely nothing careerish about it, right? That arts degree is, that and a couple of dollars will get you on the bus. So, towards the end of that, I did think I need to actually now get something a little bit more work related. So, at that time, I was lucky that I had the ability. So I went to school in Toronto, up through university, and then because I'm a dual citizen, I knew that I would be able to apply to schools in the States and do some, post undergrad work there. And I found a school that seemed to fit the bill, and they had an MBA program, and their program was tightly tied around looking at the US's relationship with Canada. And I thought that was kind of hilarious because we all are used to Americans not really knowing anything about Canada. But this was a school that actually, in their MBA program, had a stream that focused on Canada and the US, which is all about like the trade, the business that goes on between us. So I thought, okay, that's good. So I went and did the MBA there. I was there and had a single marketing course, and it kind of stood out to me as something that was rather interesting because, in a business degree, you're going to get a lot of quantitative data thrown at you. You got to do these exercises, statistics. But in the marketing one, we were using those statistics to actually understand how a company was able to get customers. And I thought, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. They need to know how that happens. Wait a minute, where do they even get the customers from? And I'm sounding very, ignorant. I was. But it kind of tweaked in my head that, all right, this marketing function, that it's got this nice blend of text and quantitative work, and it's actually doing something very fundamental to how a business is. And I did understand, my parents had a small business that, if you don't have customers, you don't have a business. So felt to myself, all right, if I'm somewhere over on that side, I had, other MBA classmates that were going into the accounting stream and other areas, operations. And, that's all fine and good for them. But I felt that staying close to, the revenue side of it, not the things that, okay, we're just going to figure out how to get 1% more cost efficiency on our operations. I thought it more interesting to think about the growth opportunities that you could unleash if you're focused on the acquisition side of things.
Following that, I think what you kind of mentioned earlier was how that marketing course, lit a a spark within you in regards to, hey, this is something I could see myself doing, or following that path down. did you make any major changes to start looking into marketing a bit further? Maybe take on more courses and an internship or seeking out jobs? Or how did that process go from there when you maybe, hit that fork in the road? Because I think a lot of our guests hit that fork where they're like, hey, like, I was going from here to here, but then out of nowhere I realized, hey, I actually want to go maybe to the right side a bit. So what did that look like for you?
It took time. I'm pretty slow on things. I don't tend to move as fast. I'll get there, but here's how it worked. I got out of my MBA program, which I told you specialized on kind of Canada, US, and this is at a time we're just coming into the agreements that became NAFTA, and then now it's USMCA, but basically something that allowed these two humongous economies to act more like a entire North American bloc, and this seemed to me to open up. It just blew the doors open on saying, okay, well, I can be a company somewhere in the US or somewhere in Canada, but now I have access to the entire market. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. Again, dating myself, the internet's really not much at this point. So you've got to remember, most of what people are in business to do is to sell a physical product. So that product traveling across a border, all of a sudden with the borders opening up, it's a big deal. So what did I do? Knowing about this, I did look around at companies that actually, manufacture things and that, but I came across a company that works in the space that you have to get involved in if you're ever taking something across the border. So importing and exporting. And they are a company that they're actually the third largest in their field that handles all of the logistics of getting across that border, as well as filing the notification and the formal entry with the government. So they're called a customs broker, but they're in charge of handling, taxes remitted for when the product crosses. They are in charge of a lot of those things. I got in with them, and for a little while I was just taking whatever they had, and that involved they threw me at things like spreadsheets. We had this tool, maybe some of you have heard of it, it's called Lotus 123. It was kind of like the very first thing that what we would now call Excel or Google Sheets, but it did that functionality. So they had me kind of slicing and dicing all this stuff related to trade. Yet they were trying their best to actually morph into a company that would get more clients and have deeper relationships with their clients. And so though they were doing quite well, there's like several thousand people in this company, they tried to transform themselves with opening themselves to taking all the data that they had about this, goods flowing back and forth. And if if you are my client, I know all of the products that you have. I have to tell the government all this information about that product that you make. Why don't I make a software product that helps you run your business better? So, but that was very disruptive. That was nothing like what they had done before, but it was putting kind of a digital face on this very old paper-based world that they lived in. And they decided that they needed a marketing team to help with the ideation of those products and the development of those products alongside of some coders, and getting into the actual penetration of those products into their client base, and then into more customers that would come to them because they had this special thing that other companies didn't have. And I got into the marketing department there, and the first role they looked at, they saw that I'd been doing analysis. So they said, well, why don't you come and analyze our market for us? So I had this amazing job where I had their information and, StatsCan information and the US Census information and all these, corporate data banks that we subscribe to. And I was just able to, with that vision of let's find a way to make our company more marketable, make things that are more marketable for our users. Let's go ahead and figure out what that is. And so it was like, most people don't talk about their school projects, as being interesting. To me, I looked at it like a school project, but it was a school project with real dollars attached to it. And it got me thinking, okay, this, using data to do marketing, this is fantastic. This is really, if I could keep doing this, I would love it.
To build on that, then, where my mind kind of goes, obviously doing this podcast 171 times, I start to think of, hey, how do routes start to, let's say take that snowball effect where you start to build on those previous experiences. So my mind's going one of two ways, or there's two different ways that my mind's going.
Yep.
One is you go down the lane, I'm assuming, of continuing to work with customs or brokering, deals between Canada and US and helping companies do that. Or two, from what you're saying, is analyzing how to better optimize marketing is what I assume from the thing you're saying, is taking that data and applying it. Is that something where you went to one or the other?
Oh, I was very torn at that fork in the road, but I chose the second. And I chose it. And what's funny, Chris, is here we are in 2024. I feel like if I were younger, a younger person today who's in 2024 and listening to what's happening in the AI field, I can identify a lot with how they feel, because to me it's reminiscent of that era in the very late 90s with the internet first kind of opening. You have that kind of faltering with the .com, explosion. But you do have other companies that kind of pick up the scraps, and we start to actually see the internet being used for business. And then we start to get beyond this idea of you have to physically get a product, from one place to another. We're starting to see, I can, have an online store and get the product shipped to you. Or I can make a digital product like software, and now if I can use the internet to get it to you, I don't even have to think about anything physically at all. So that period of time made me think, I love what the field of trade and all that data gives me, but this marketing thing is very powerful. It's kind of on steroids when you use the internet to do it, because I was starting to see search engines. I was starting to see the importance of websites and content come into it to attract those customers. And so I leaned very hard at those. The company at that time, they were saying, let's put all our money in trade shows. Let's give all of our money to our vast direct sales force. And I was coming along saying, I can, for much smaller outlay, bring in people who are filling out forms on our website who want to talk to somebody. Can we do some more of that? So, to kind of take us a little farther ahead, I left that company and then did a string of software companies, because I had seen the kind of magic of how if you have a small team of coders, you can make a product that kind of does anything, and you can find ways to get that marketed and get that out. So I took what was then, today it doesn't seem like a risk at all. It seems like a no-brainer. But back then, so I'm talking 2002, I took the risk, right, just in the lull after the .com crash, of saying my career is now going to be about marketing technology and software technology, I guess, in an even tighter definition, because I believe that it's a great way to get those buyers out there who have a real problem that they need to be solved. This is a way to bring world-leading expertise to solving that problem. And I was quite happy with how that was. But there is something I just want to tease here, and that was something that maybe I had been riding that high of doing all of that wonderful analysis at the previous company. And what I found when I was getting into these technology companies, particularly as I moved into smaller and smaller companies. So I went from, let's say, a 3,000 person company down to like a 100 person company. And then I would, start to move up in their marketing, and, I'm now in a 50 person company. So I am the head marketer, and then I'm maybe in a 25 person company, and I'm their only marketer. And as I'm getting into those areas, I still love the amount of zest, the team spirit, we can build anything. But it's starting to become very apparent to me that this marketing is not just a science fair project, that there are actually people who are depending on this company to work for their livelihood. And it starts to get pretty weighty for me. So I'll finish with the story of the 25 person company. We're now in 2008, early 2008, and I joined this company. I'm their sole marketer. I am reporting to the CEO, but dotted line to the chief revenue officer. And the chief revenue officer, in a pretty blunt way, just says to me, look, I get your marketing presentations. I hear what you're talking about, all the plans that you've got for us here. I only care that I get qualified leads. And then he walks out. And I'm left thinking to myself, okay, if that is the single metric that I and everybody's job in this company depends on, I better get better at doing that than I've ever been before. And that, unfortunately, in that company, because they were a little bit overinvested, they'd gotten a little bit too much venture capital, and they did not have enough runway with the 2008 financial crisis, that head of sales's words ended up being the thing that put the company under, because they did not have a pipeline, and there wasn't enough time to fix that problem, and so they ended up putting padlocks on the doors. That's what drove that message home for me.
And to then build on that, because that's obviously very relevant for, I'm sure, many people listening, just getting qualified leads. What was the learning that you then took away from that to then start finding, better ways to get qualified leads? How did you then solve that problem that came about?
Yeah, so, the first thing, I suppose, was just a reality check of, I thought I knew about it, but I really didn't know jack about doing that. We jump into another phase of kind of the career at this point, because I decided that, some flickering idea that I had of being able to maybe spread my risk as a marketer amongst a few companies, maybe that's a better idea than just throwing my lot in with an entire company with a full-time job and expecting that every single time that would work out. So after that company was closed, I started to become a marketing consultant, and I realized, so this is now, 2009, 10, somewhere there, that the need that these companies have is to leverage the internet, but to do it in a way that has that urgency. So for me, when I was looking around at different marketing channels that you could use on the internet at that time, things like SEO were kind of too long and too nebulous for me to say, yeah, I believe in this. I'm going to, stand on this ground and tell you that, I draw a hard line here. No, SEO wasn't it. But at that point, I had been using another thing that was a good marketing channel for the couple of companies I'd used it for. For about maybe 6 years, I'd been using something called Google AdWords. And I figured out that because that is using the number one search engine to simply find people and get them at the time that they are asking specifically for a particular thing, so they have that intent to know about that thing and maybe move further down the funnel on buying it, I felt that I could use pay-per-click. And what that unbundled for me was that I actually could figure out this qualified lead thing if I was willing to understand all of the crazy data that is used to run these pay-per-click campaigns, and I was willing to stick my head into the other systems. So not just learning how to use a system like a CRM, but to actually learn how to make reports out of them and to actually get underneath the interface down to the data inside them. I figured that if I could inquire all through that and try to make sense of that whole maze, then I would be able to do what this head of sales had challenged me to do. And in a way, I really wanted, it wasn't like a vendetta, but it was, a wake-up moment where I thought, okay, to actually begin to answer the question that that person has, I need to be able to provide things. And I bet there's many companies out there where, and we talk about marketing as being an external sale. I'm speaking right now of the sale that needs to happen to the CEO of every company by their sales and marketing team. The trust me, this is going to work message that they need to be sold on. And I really felt I had to get a good grasp of that at the exact same time as I was figuring out this, how do you run internet campaigns and get qualified leads, and those two things I found, and I still find, that I'm jumping back and forth between them because you need both for it to work.
And then kind of building on that, how did that then translate when you begin to start, let's say, answering that question that was initially posed to you about that from that CRO? What does that then look like? Is that something where as you begin to learn how to answer that question, new opportunities are arising? I know you mentioned you were consulting as well. Did that maybe question like land you in a maybe not even a fork on the road, but maybe 4 different routes to go in the road, and you're like, hey, which way do I go? Consulting, taking a new career path, or simply trying to find a way to solve that? How did it go from there?
Great question. I had been so lucky early in my career to be in places where I never needed to think about the revenue, that this desire to get closer to understanding what it really means to acquire customers and to get a growth engine built that does that, wisely or unwisely, I felt that I needed to put myself more in the shoes of that client that I'm talking to. So I had always been, if we kind of look at how you define marketers, we say that marketers work either in-house, or we call that the brand side, or they work in an agency, right, on the vendor side. And I felt that once I'd kind of narrowed down to realizing that this world of pay-per-click marketing and generating leads for B2B companies was something that I felt like I was getting quite good at, that I understood how to make sense of all that data, that I understood how things on the internet that were constantly changing by the guys at Google were things that I could keep up with. I decided one of the antidotes that I could use to help answer that question to a CEO that wants to be convinced of how to do this marketing and have the faith to put the budget in it, was I decided to kind of proceduralize how I had run these PPC campaigns, and then get a few people around me who could do it the way I laid out it to be done. And so I hatched an agency, and that was in 2013. And the agency was a lead generation agency focused on digital campaigns for B2B companies. And that made us, I always referred to us as client number 0. Because when you have an agency, it's a company too. And it needs to be nourished just like the client companies do. So we would use the same practices to generate our own leads that we were doing for those other companies. I felt at the time that I could be a consultant, and consultants can kind of like bounce around or meet people at the, sports club or at a bar or social setting and pick up a client here or there. But if you're an agency and you actually have, contractors and staff, you have to have an actual plan of how you're going to keep that service business going yourself. That's what I decided to do. And it was very difficult, but I will stand by the fact that it gave me a clarity like no other on what it would take to get companies from point A to point B in their marketing journey. And it would give me such an authentic voice to speak with those decision makers because I was just like them.
I guess building on that, from that journey, right? I'm sure there's years and different experiences that you gain from that. What did that path look like? Because obviously I tried starting my own sports marketing agency. It wasn't, I'm sure, as the same amount of time as you did it, but in that time frame, I felt like I learned so much. And I see on LinkedIn that you did that for 10 years, so I'm sure there's way more experiences and different things that you were able to learn. How did that path how did that path form is maybe a better way to ask that question, where you realized, hey, I'm not just going to simply pick up clients by, let's say socializing, networking, etc., but it actually needs to be an agency where I need to bring in that revenue, maybe going back to getting those qualified leads and applying it yourself. How did you maybe manage that, where you realized, hey, like, as cool as it is to maybe start something on your own, it becomes very real very fast, I'd assume.
Yeah, it really does, Chris. When you've never run a business before, and you just start on it, you might have all of these ideas and plans. I would say the one common element of that 10 years was continually trying new things. So I had one former boss, when he was talking about, that classic graph of revenue, and we all know what it's supposed to look like, but he said it never just independently points up and to the right. And, I feel that when you're in your own business, you kind of have to stifle that here's how it should be voice that is speaking up, because your experience is going to be completely different. Maybe it will, but it's not likely to. It's likely to, be up and down. And so the only common element that I can point at is you want to figure out, are we doing things that are working? And if we can, let's double down on those. And let's be honest with ourselves about the things that we thought were going to work, but now we've realized are not going to work. So I was always seeking the input from my team. Does it look like this is working to you? What little test could we use to try and help us see if this is working for this client? Okay, could it work for other clients? Or the marketing that we're doing for ourselves, did we see anything from that? So it's this kind of constant hive of, it feels really uncertain when you're, honest about it. It kind of feels like you don't know which way you're going, but I think that's better than a bullheaded, well, we are going to, here's our 5 or 10 year plan, and we, are so sure of ourselves that this is absolutely going to be how it's going to go. And I never experienced that. But I feel that that kind of rough scientific method that we were following is really the only ground truth that you can grasp onto, and that it's the one thing that will probably steer you right towards having the business for as long as the macro conditions can support it. That's the only solid ground I think I can point to. Everything else is either coming from a guru who wants to sell you something, or is probably, at least in the marketing world, it's probably a technique, and you're hearing about it now because its best days are past it. And what you don't know is that most of the people who were doing it have left the room, and now you're going to try to do what their case study already proved worked, but everybody else has moved on. So you're actually in the exact wrong time to try that. So the only thing you really should be doing is seeking your own source of ideas for where to go next, and not trying to follow somebody else's playbook.
I think that's a great point, because even, I think, like, going back to my experiences, I think I can also agree with that, where I feel like I had all these ideas, wanted to try so many different things, but then that could also, bog you down, where, you're spreading yourself too thin. But then, like you said there, if you just focus on the things that you're doing well, or moving on from the things that weren't necessarily going to go the distance, that's where you start getting that traction, being able to move forward from there. So I think that's a great point. And I guess going on from the business, where did your route then go from there? I'm assuming after each step, and I think from speaking to all the different guests I've had, you get to almost like these different forks in the roads all the time. Obviously, each route that you end up taking leads to that as well, but where did that lead you afterwards?
Sure. So we're coming up to 2022-ish, and, we're obviously in pandemic times. So, nobody's really loving it. There's much uncertainty on the horizon. And in the world of my niche of digital advertising, you have folks like Google. They're not the only ones. Meta was certainly there. And Microsoft through Bing and LinkedIn, who were saying, this setup that we've given you to run your own ads, and the fact that we've made it rather complicated, so complicated that you might turn to a lead generation agency like Glenn's. We found out that AI can actually do a ton of that stuff, and the AI can auto configure these things and react more quickly. So we're really going to phase out those campaigns that allowed that manual control. So that, for me, among a few other things related to where I saw those trillion-dollar companies taking us, and knowing how concentrated they were in running the world of online ads, and the fact that they have a concentration of being the ones who run both the system for making the money off of it, as well as they write the platform that runs the ads. So inherent conflict of interest. All of those things together, said to me, all right, this has all been great, but focusing around a service business where you're using an hour of a human's time to configure something that won't need to be configured nearly as much, this is probably the time at which I need to head to the exit. So I did. And what I retained, there were two things I retained from that era. Number one, I had also really enjoyed the data that was available through even platforms like Google's. So I'm not saying, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Google Ads, definitely it's morphed. It's not the product it was in 2013, that I made my decisions on at that time. But if you take another product like Google Analytics, for a product which has a zero entry price that can provide fantastic information when it's properly set up and tied to the other systems in your marketing stack, I still very much see great promise in using tools like that together to answer that initial question, how's my marketing going to work and get me those qualified leads? So I've, if anything, doubled down on my interest in that analytics and in using some of the very tools that they're using to automate, but using those tools to show companies how they can make this information easier to digest and understand what's going on, but that they can also feed the machine learning algorithms out there on the search engines and elsewhere with information that's going to help those tools find them their next batch of customers.
I know that's very interesting. Just hearing how that all kind of transpires, and even like I knew some other people as well that did something similar in regards to running ad campaigns for different people. And obviously, the last couple of years, as soon as things start to change, obviously they had to evolve, right? And I think that's the same thing you're saying. And it sounds like you were able to kind of come out of especially your business with a lot of different learnings and things that you could take away. And just looking at LinkedIn too, I think the next thing that would then just progress was you getting into teaching, right? With becoming a professor. Is that something where you wanted to enter that path because you felt like you learned so much that you wanted to share that knowledge?
In part, but it was bridged by something else, which I think you and I are both pleasantly surprised by how well this works. It's podcasting. So, not going to lie, back in 2015, 2016, I was looking around at the ways that I could generate qualified leads. Surprise, surprise. For the marketing agency. I'd had a blog. I was not the best blogger, but, I did dutifully banged out, I think, 100 or maybe a few more than that posts, but it was a drudgery. So in about 2016, I thought to myself, and I had the counsel of a few other people. I'd gone to a workshop, and one person said to me, you really should start a podcast, and you should not tie it to whatever your business is. You should make it with a name that's something else and, try to just talk about the same topic. So started something called Funnel Reboot. And it was there to mainly chronicle the learning that I was getting out of what I was seeing. And obviously it had a little bit of a lead gen component to it. But what I chose to do is I made that very soft. I had been listening to some of these people who espouse this thing called content marketing, which is, sell by helping. So I started to interview people, and I interviewed book authors that were coming out with new techniques to do digital marketing and to do analytics. And one thing led to another. The whole started off quite slow, but the podcast started. I started to see more interest, and I started to see that people, when they understood, even if I was just interviewing someone, that I was following on the conversation, maybe getting that guest to share something interesting, that someone would understand that they could share their problem with me. And if it was a marketing problem, I might be able to help them with it. So I was very happy with how that was going. And coming up to, let's say, 2023, it provided an opening to start teaching at the college and university level, just bit by bit, a single course, and then another, and then another, and then, a sibling institution saying, hey, well, you taught this at their institution, can you teach it for us? And this has been a great thing for me to continue, but simply switching to another seat at the table, right? I'm still, and this is, I think, a really important point, is that I don't believe in people following a completely linear path as if they are running away from the things that they've done before. For me, I might use new skills to do it, but I very much enjoy staying in the same general area, general subject matter, or maybe just making a slight twist on it. But I'm always kind of, this is what to me a pivot is about, is you're keeping one foot at what you had at a strength, but you're adding something. So for me, the podcast was adding audio. Doesn't sound like much. I was petrified about trying to do this when I started. But then I realized if I could bring my whole self to the role of explaining something or asking questions, that I'm not only giving that information, but I'm also providing some positioning. And the positioning has led to some surprising outcomes like the teaching.
No, that's great to hear. I can definitely see how, that would build into that. Obviously, when you're sharing that great knowledge and people are seeing the value that you do have, I can definitely see how that would, come about, and very cool that it did. And I guess with that kind of gets us to the end of our route and maybe getting to those questions I like to wrap up each episode with. So, this is episode 171, and I've said this 171 times now. I'm going to live until I'm 103. I'm going to be on a rocking chair. Think about all the cool things I did in my career so far, right? I want to put Glenn in the exact same seat. So you're going to be on that rocking chair at 103 years old. Think about all the cool things you've done in your career so far to date. What's one story at 103 you'll be able to remember and be like, wow, I can't believe I did that for a career at one point in time.
You know what's funny is, to me, when you talk about that, it's not the glamour. I don't think of like, standing up and hearing my name called for an award. Here's my story, and I haven't brought this up yet, but I'm a father of 3 boys, and my boys all played hockey growing up, and my eldest son, who is now 24, he was a very accomplished athlete in his time playing hockey. In fact, he played hockey up until he was 20 years old, which is pretty rare, and was able to play across a significant chunk of Canada and the U.S. As a hockey player into, what could have potentially been heading towards the NCAA. And it ended with COVID. But point is, when someone is trying to raise children and they have, this kind of, that's a lot of involvement. As anyone who has had a kid in sports will say, it's a lot. And then I've got 2 other children who are also, full up with their own activities. And my wife and I are just trying to make sure that we can get, these 3 dudes through the life that we want, and having no clue where they're going to be going at the time, but knowing that this means being out, no kidding, 4 out of 5 nights of the week, and for, I would say, at least a half of each day on the weekend. Both of us. So, for me, where if you caught me anywhere in that, 12-year, 14-year time span of doing all that, probably sitting, freezing my butt off in a hockey rink, what really stood out for me was that I could do marketing from a laptop sitting on that seat in that hockey rink. That was, to me, both in the years where there was good revenue and in the years where there was not, to me, that was something that I will be very happy for, to think that what sounded kooky 10 years before, if I was in corporate and you'd have told me that I wouldn't have to be in corporate anymore, that I would be able to sustain things by doing podcasting and, having team meetings on, a virtual call and keeping it all rolling while I'm sitting watching a hockey practice or a hockey game, that to me is something that will always take me through. And I suppose the takeaway there is that we all have a chance to have a custom designed life. It's up to us whether or not we want to follow what we're told or do a roll your own solution where you're willing to take the rap for the ways that it doesn't work and that you'll have to sand off those edges to make it work. But the fact that you can even do it, to me, is something that if you have the courage to try it, I'm so happy that you can. And even with the bumps and scrapes, looking back on it, it's something that you will always be proud you did.
No, I think that's a great way to kind of put it, and almost leads perfectly into the last question I'd like to ask, which is obviously when into the future. We heard about, what you've been able to do so far as well throughout this whole podcast. Now let's go back to, high school Glenn, when you're editing the yearbook, right? If you go back in time and speak with that younger self, what's that one piece of advice that you would share with young Glenn? If you could just shake him and be like, hey, this is something you need to know. I've learned this throughout all my years. I think this is going to be, vastly important to you. Would it be what you just mentioned, or is there something else that you think, hey, this is also a great thing to keep in mind?
Oh, man. Well, if I had a few minutes with that guy, I would, be brutally truthful with him and tell him about all the things that he should not do. But to answer your question, I would say to him, it looks rather chaotic to you right now. You don't know why you're learning these things. That stuff on the yearbook you probably don't see much sense in doing. That, foray in that, kind of failed attempt at figuring out a coding camp thing. Don't worry. These are circling around things that you will be seeing, and on your 5th or your 10th or your 20th time, you will be glad that you had this early exposure to that. And I'm going to borrow something. So at that time, I was growing up in Toronto. As I say, Toronto had an air show. There's this thing that planes, particularly planes before we could have, the new jets that can go do anything. But there was this maneuver that you could even use a propeller plane to watch. And I heard it described at the air show. And ever since then, it's kind of stuck in my head. But there's this path that an airplane can take where it can manage to do something it shouldn't by the laws of physics do. The thing is called an Immelman turn. It's nothing more than if an airplane is going along and, if we're in like a conflict situation, you got two planes. You don't want to have two planes going at each other. They can kind of shoot at each other. But if the plane that wants to get mastery over the situation speeds up and rapidly climbs, if they keep climbing, they're going to stall. But if they rapidly climb and they turn back, they can come kind of back over the same area of land that they were in, but at a higher level. And they can see more, they can see farther, they can buy time, they can always dive if they need. That's a very good thing from a combat standpoint. But I always thought about, okay, don't think so much about trying to get out of this town or go do something that sounds prestigious, or be okay with the fact that you're going to still be using these little tools of writing and speaking and a little bit of, running numbers. Those things that you're just doing on a very small scale now, you're going to be basically doing an Immelman turn on those later, and you're going to keep coming back at them, but it's not going to be for the same stakes, right? It'll be on a bigger scale, or it'll be using some other new things that you've picked up along the way. But be okay with the fact that you are going to stay in this general area, kind of going back and forth.
No, I think that's a great way to end the podcast, and why I like asking those two questions at the end, because I think it puts a nice bow on it all. So, Glenn, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Unless there's anything else to share, I really appreciate having you on.
I'll just say that I welcome people reaching out to me, whether it's on X, whether it's on LinkedIn, any social network. I'm Hey Glenn S. And I'm so glad that you are doing this so that people can share the route that they've taken.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, contact Glenn if you'd like. Check him out on social media. And that's it for episode 171. And we'll see everyone next episode. Thank you.